Your emotional triggers aren't random. They're precisely calibrated neural programs that hijack your consciousness faster than you can blink. Understanding these programs is the difference between living as a reactive victim of your own nervous system and becoming the conscious architect of your emotional experience. For millennia, philosophers have grappled with the relationship between emotion and reason, often positioning them as opposing forces in human consciousness. The Stoics advocated emotional suppression. The Romantics celebrated emotional expression. Modern neuroscience reveals both approaches as fundamentally misguided. Emotions aren't obstacles to overcome or impulses to indulge, but sophisticated information processing systems that can be understood, interpreted, and skillfully directed. An emotional trigger is not simply a stimulus that makes you feel something. It's a complex neurobiological program that bypasses conscious thought to generate immediate behavioral responses. These programs evolved over millions of years to ensure survival in environments where hesitation meant death, but they now operate in contexts they were never designed to handle, often creating more problems than they solve. The philosophical significance of mastering emotional triggers extends far beyond personal comfort or social harmony. Your emotional responses literally construct your experienced reality. The neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett describes emotions not as reactions to the world, but as your brain's predictions about what the world means and how you should respond to it. When you change your relationship with emotional triggers, you change the fundamental architecture of your consciousness. This creates what I call the trigger paradox. The very emotional reactions that feel most automatic and beyond your control actually contain the deepest information about your values, fears, and unconscious patterns. Your strongest triggers point directly to your most important growth edges, but only if you learn to decode rather than simply react to their messages. Consider the ancient concept of equanimity, found in Buddhist philosophy, not the absence of emotional response, but the capacity to remain centered and clear-minded regardless of external circumstances. Neuroscience now reveals that equanimity isn't a personality trait but a learnable skill involving specific brain regions that can be strengthened through understanding and practice. The anterior insula, which processes interoceptive awareness, your ability to sense your internal bodily states, plays a crucial role in emotional regulation. People with stronger insular development can detect emotional activation earlier in its progression, creating more time and space for conscious response rather than automatic reaction. This is the neurobiological basis of what contemplative traditions call mindfulness, or presence. But emotional mastery goes deeper than simply managing reactions. When you understand the hidden logic of your triggers, you gain access to unconscious information about your deepest needs, values, and patterns that can guide authentic decision-making and personal development. Your emotional triggers become teachers rather than tyrants, sources of wisdom rather than sources of suffering. The key insight is that emotional triggers aren't problems to be solved but codes to be cracked. Each trigger contains specific information about your internal landscape, what you value, what you fear, where you feel vulnerable, and how you've learned to protect yourself. Learning to decode this information transforms triggers from unconscious liabilities into conscious assets. Understanding how to master emotional triggers requires examining how they form in the first place. Your brain is constantly creating associations between external events and internal states, building what neuroscientists call emotional memories that can be activated instantaneously by relevant cues. The amygdala, often called the brain's alarm system, plays the central role in trigger formation. This almond-shaped structure receives sensory information milliseconds before it reaches conscious awareness, scanning for patterns associated with past emotional experiences. When the amygdala detects a potential match, it triggers a cascade of neurochemical and physiological responses designed to prepare you for action. This process, called amygdala hijack by psychologist Daniel Goleman, occurs approximately 200 milliseconds faster than conscious thought. Your body is already flooding with stress hormones, your heart rate is accelerating, and your attention is narrowing before your prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for rational analysis, even registers what's happening. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation and context processing, works closely with the amygdala to create and store emotional associations. Unlike explicit memories that you can consciously recall, emotional memories are often implicit, stored as bodily sensations, behavioral tendencies, and automatic response patterns that influence your behavior without conscious awareness. This is why emotional triggers can feel so mysterious and powerful. You might find yourself inexplicably angry when someone uses a particular tone of voice, anxious in certain social situations, or defensive when specific topics arise, without understanding why. The triggers are accessing implicit emotional memories formed during significant past experiences, often in childhood when your brain was most plastic and vulnerable to programming. The process becomes more complex when we consider intergenerational trauma, emerging research showing that emotional patterns can be transmitted across generations through epigenetic mechanisms. Your triggers might not even originate from your own direct experiences but from ancestral emotional patterns encoded in your genes and activated by environmental cues. Neuroscientist Rachel Yehuda's research on Holocaust survivors and their descendants reveals that trauma can create biological changes that affect gene expression in ways that get passed to offspring. Children and grandchildren of trauma survivors show similar stress response patterns and trigger sensitivities, even when they never directly experienced the original traumatic events. This means that mastering your emotional triggers isn't just personal development, it's breaking cycles of unconscious reactivity that may have persisted across generations. When you learn to respond consciously rather than react automatically, you're literally changing the emotional legacy you pass to future generations. The key insight is that triggers aren't random emotional reactions. They're precisely calibrated response programs created by your nervous system to handle situations your brain has categorized as emotionally significant. Understanding this allows you to approach triggers with curiosity rather than judgment, investigation rather than suppression. To master emotional triggers, you must understand the precise sequence of neurobiological events that occur during emotional hijacking. This process unfolds in predictable stages, and awareness of these stages creates opportunities for conscious intervention at multiple points in the sequence. Stage 1 is sensory detection, occurring within 12 to 15 milliseconds of stimulus presentation. Your sensory organs, eyes, ears, skin, nose, detect environmental information and transmit it simultaneously to two brain regions: the thalamus, for conscious processing, and the amygdala, for threat assessment. This dual pathway means your emotional brain receives information before your thinking brain, setting up the potential for reactive responses. Stage 2 is pattern matching, happening around 20 to 30 milliseconds after detection. Your amygdala compares incoming sensory information against stored emotional memories, looking for patterns associated with past significant experiences. This comparison occurs below conscious awareness but determines whether your system will classify the current situation as safe, threatening, or emotionally significant. Stage 3 involves physiological activation, beginning around 50 to 100 milliseconds after initial detection. If the amygdala detects a pattern match with stored emotional memories, it triggers the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding your system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate increases, breathing changes, muscles tense, and attention narrows, all before conscious awareness of what's happening. Stage 4 is behavioral impulse generation, occurring around 100 to 150 milliseconds after detection. Your brain generates automatic behavioral programs designed to handle the perceived emotional situation, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses that feel compelling and urgent. These impulses arise from evolutionary programming designed for physical survival but activated by psychological triggers. Stage 5 involves conscious awareness, finally emerging around 200 to 500 milliseconds after initial detection. This is when your prefrontal cortex comes online and you become consciously aware of feeling triggered. By this point, your body is already flooded with stress chemicals, your attention has narrowed, and powerful behavioral impulses are demanding action. Most people experience emotional mastery as impossible because they're trying to intervene at stage 5, after the hijacking process is essentially complete. But understanding the earlier stages reveals multiple intervention points where conscious awareness can interrupt automatic programming. The story of Michael Santos illustrates this perfectly. As a project manager in a high-pressure tech company, Michael found himself consistently triggered by what he perceived as public criticism during team meetings. His pattern was predictable. Someone would question his decisions, he'd feel his chest tighten, his face flush, and within seconds he'd become defensive and argumentative, often damaging relationships and undermining his credibility. Through developing trigger awareness, Michael learned to recognize the early warning signs, the initial chest sensation that occurred in stage 3, before the full emotional flood. By catching the trigger at this earlier stage, he could implement breathing techniques that activated his parasympathetic nervous system, interrupting the stress response cascade before it reached behavioral impulse generation. Within months, colleagues noticed Michael's increased emotional stability and thoughtful responses under pressure. He hadn't eliminated his triggers, he'd learned to work with them skillfully, using early detection to create space for conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. Perhaps the most transformative insight about emotional triggers is that they contain sophisticated intelligence about your inner landscape, information that becomes accessible only when you learn to decode their messages rather than simply react to their intensity. Every trigger is attempting to communicate something important about your values, boundaries, needs, or unconscious patterns. This intelligence operates through what neuroscientists call somatic markers, bodily sensations that carry emotional and motivational information below the threshold of conscious thought. Your gut feelings, muscle tension, energy shifts, and breathing changes are all part of an internal communication system that processes complex emotional and social information faster than rational analysis. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio discovered that people with damage to their ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the brain region that processes somatic markers, become incapable of making good decisions despite intact logical reasoning abilities. They could analyze options rationally but couldn't access the emotional wisdom that guides optimal choices. This research reveals that emotions aren't obstacles to good decision-making, they're essential components of it. Understanding this principle transforms your relationship with triggers from resistance to collaboration. Instead of asking, "How do I stop feeling this?" you begin asking, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" This shift activates your prefrontal cortex's analytical capabilities while honoring your emotional system's wisdom. Consider the different types of information your triggers might contain. Anger often signals boundary violations. Someone is crossing limits that matter to your sense of dignity, autonomy, or values. The intensity of anger often correlates directly with the importance of the boundary being violated. Learning to decode anger's message allows you to address boundary issues consciously rather than reactively. Anxiety frequently points to unmet safety or control needs. Your nervous system might be detecting threats, real or imagined, to your security, predictability, or ability to handle upcoming challenges. Anxiety's message often involves preparation needs. You need more information, support, or resources to handle what's coming. Decoded skillfully, anxiety becomes a planning and preparation signal rather than a source of suffering. Sadness often indicates loss or disconnection from people, values, dreams, or aspects of yourself that matter deeply. The depth of sadness frequently reflects the significance of what's been lost or threatened. Understanding sadness as an information system about your attachments and values allows you to address loss consciously and make decisions that honor what matters most to you. The story of Dr. Amanda Foster demonstrates this principle beautifully. As a successful cardiologist, Amanda found herself consistently triggered by patient interactions that reminded her of her father's death from heart disease 20 years earlier. These triggers would cause her to become either over-involved with patients, trying to save everyone, or emotionally distant, protecting herself from loss. Rather than trying to eliminate these triggers, Amanda learned to decode their message. The intense emotional reactions were pointing to her deepest motivation for becoming a cardiologist, honoring her father's memory and preventing other families from experiencing similar loss. Understanding this allowed Amanda to channel her trigger energy consciously into more effective patient care while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Her triggers had transformed from sources of emotional instability into sources of professional wisdom and authentic motivation. By learning their language, Amanda gained access to emotional intelligence that made her both a better doctor and a more integrated person. Mastering emotional triggers requires understanding the neurobiological differences between reactive and responsive states. These represent fundamentally different modes of brain function, each with distinct patterns of neural activation, hormonal release, and behavioral tendencies. Reactive states are characterized by what neuroscientist Dan Siegel calls amygdala hijack. The emotional brain takes control while the rational brain goes offline. Brain imaging shows decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, reduced communication between brain hemispheres, and heightened activation in limbic regions associated with threat detection and survival responses. During reactive states, your brain literally changes its processing priorities. The hormone cortisol, released during stress responses, actually impairs memory formation and rational thinking while enhancing emotional memory consolidation. This is why you might not remember exactly what someone said during a heated argument, but you'll vividly remember how they made you feel. Responsive states, by contrast, involve what researchers call prefrontal limbic integration. Your emotional brain and rational brain work together harmoniously. Brain scans show balanced activation across multiple regions, enhanced communication between hemispheres, and optimal levels of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine that support clear thinking and emotional regulation. The key to shifting from reactive to responsive states lies in understanding what neuroscientist Stephen Porges calls the polyvagal hierarchy, your autonomic nervous system's three-tiered response system that evolved to handle different types of challenges. The first tier is the parasympathetic, social engagement system, mediated by the ventral vagus nerve. When this system is active, you feel calm, connected, and capable of complex thinking and empathetic responses. This is the optimal state for conscious trigger management because your full cognitive and emotional resources are available. The second tier is the sympathetic mobilization system, which generates fight or flight responses through adrenaline and cortisol release. This system is designed for handling physical threats through increased heart rate, muscle tension, and narrowed attention. While appropriate for actual dangers, sympathetic activation impairs the nuanced thinking required for skillful trigger navigation. The third tier is the parasympathetic immobilization system, controlled by the dorsal vagus nerve. This system generates freeze, collapse, or dissociation responses when threats seem overwhelming or inescapable. While protective in extreme situations, dorsal vagal activation creates disconnection from both internal awareness and external engagement. The crucial insight is that you can learn to recognize which autonomic state you're in and consciously shift toward social engagement when circumstances allow. This shift creates the neurobiological foundation for responsive rather than reactive trigger management. Specific techniques can reliably activate your social engagement system. Slow, deep breathing with longer exhales than inhales stimulates your ventral vagus nerve. Gentle self-touch, like placing a hand on your heart, activates oxytocin release that counters stress hormones. Brief loving kindness phrases toward yourself or others trigger neural networks associated with care and connection. The story of Dr. Rachel Kim, an emergency room physician, illustrates this mastery beautifully. Working in high-stress environments with life or death decisions, Rachel initially found herself frequently triggered by aggressive or demanding patients, leading to defensive responses that compromised patient care and her own well-being. Through developing autonomic awareness, Rachel learned to recognize early signs of sympathetic activation, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, and used brief regulation techniques between patient interactions. A 30-second breathing practice, combined with a silent intention of compassion, would shift her back into social engagement mode where she could respond to difficult patients with both professionalism and empathy. Over time, Rachel's colleagues noticed her remarkable ability to de-escalate tense situations and maintain clarity under pressure. She hadn't eliminated stressful triggers, she'd learned to work with her nervous system consciously, accessing her full capabilities even in challenging circumstances. Transforming emotional triggers from liabilities into assets requires what I call trigger alchemy, the systematic process of converting reactive patterns into responsive wisdom. This involves specific practices that retrain your nervous system to handle emotionally activating situations with greater skill and authenticity. The first stage of trigger alchemy is somatic awareness, developing the ability to detect emotional activation in its earliest stages, before it reaches behavioral expression. This requires cultivating what researchers call interoceptive sensitivity, awareness of internal bodily sensations like heart rate changes, breathing patterns, muscle tension, and energy shifts. Most people live with remarkably low interoceptive awareness, noticing their internal state only when it becomes extreme. Developing somatic sensitivity allows you to catch triggers at stage 2 or 3 of the hijacking process, when conscious intervention is most effective. This awareness is like installing an early warning system that alerts you to emotional weather changes before the storm hits. Practice involves regular body scanning, systematically noticing physical sensations throughout your body without trying to change them. This develops the neural pathways between your insula, which processes internal sensations, and your prefrontal cortex, which can interpret and respond to this information. Over time, you develop what might be called emotional literacy, the ability to read your internal state accurately and quickly. The second stage is pattern recognition, learning to identify the specific environmental, social, or internal cues that consistently trigger emotional reactions. Your triggers aren't random. They follow predictable patterns based on your history, values, fears, and unconscious associations. Mapping these patterns allows you to anticipate and prepare for challenging situations rather than being blindsided by them. Keep a trigger journal for several weeks, noting situations that create emotional activation, the specific cues that seem most relevant, and your typical response patterns. Look for themes across different situations. Do you get triggered by feeling unheard? Feeling controlled? Feeling criticized? Feeling excluded? These patterns reveal the deeper psychological dynamics that your triggers are attempting to address. The third stage involves reframe practice, learning to consciously reinterpret triggering situations in ways that activate your prefrontal cortex rather than your amygdala. This isn't positive thinking or denial. It's developing the capacity to see multiple perspectives on emotionally charged situations, which naturally reduces their triggering intensity. When someone speaks to you in a tone that normally triggers defensiveness, practice asking, what might be going on for them right now that would explain this behavior? This shift from personalizing to contextualizing activates your social cognition networks rather than your threat detection systems, creating space for empathy and strategic thinking rather than reactive defense. The fourth stage is conscious response design, proactively deciding how you want to respond to predictable triggers rather than hoping you'll handle them well in the moment. This involves mental rehearsal and behavioral planning that pre-activates your prefrontal cortex's executive functions before emotionally challenging situations arise. If you know that certain team meetings typically trigger your anxiety, spend 5 minutes beforehand visualizing yourself remaining calm and contributing thoughtfully. This mental rehearsal literally pre-activates the neural networks you want to access during the actual situation, making conscious responses more likely than automatic reactions. Consider the transformation of Thomas Rodriguez, a talented software architect who found his career stalled due to emotional reactivity during code reviews. Thomas consistently took technical feedback as personal criticism, leading to defensive responses that alienated colleagues and supervisors despite his excellent technical skills. Through trigger alchemy practice, Thomas learned to recognize the specific cues that activated his defensiveness, certain tones of voice, particular phrases, specific facial expressions. He developed the ability to detect these triggers early and implement a brief reframing practice. This feedback is about improving the code, not evaluating my worth as a person. This simple cognitive shift, combined with breathing techniques to maintain nervous system regulation, transformed Thomas's professional relationships and career trajectory. Within months, he was leading major projects and mentoring junior developers. His triggers had become teachers that revealed his deep commitment to excellence and helped him channel that commitment more skillfully. The highest level of trigger mastery involves what I call the integration principle, the recognition that your emotional triggers contain essential information about your authentic self that, when consciously integrated, becomes a source of wisdom, creativity, and genuine personal power. This goes beyond managing reactions to actually transforming the energy of triggers into constructive action. Integration requires understanding that emotions are not problems to be solved but information to be processed. Every emotional trigger is attempting to communicate something important about your values, boundaries, needs, or growth edges. The intensity of the trigger often correlates directly with the significance of the message it contains. This perspective transforms your relationship with difficult emotions from adversarial to collaborative. Instead of trying to eliminate triggers, you learn to partner with them, using their energy and information to make more authentic decisions and take more aligned actions. Your emotional system becomes an ally in creating a life that truly reflects your deepest values and aspirations. The neuroscience of integration involves strengthening connections between your limbic system, which generates emotions, and your prefrontal cortex, which can interpret and direct emotional energy. Research by neuroscientist Dan Siegel shows that practices emphasizing awareness, acceptance, and conscious response strengthen these connections, creating what he calls emotional intelligence at the neural level. Integration also requires understanding the shadow aspect of triggers, the disowned or rejected parts of yourself that often get projected onto trigger situations. Psychological research reveals that we're most triggered by behaviors in others that mirror unacknowledged aspects of ourselves. Learning to recognize and reclaim these projections transforms external triggers into internal growth opportunities. If you're consistently triggered by controlling people, examine where you might have unacknowledged control needs or patterns. If irresponsible behavior in others pushes your buttons, explore where you might be avoiding responsibility in your own life. This shadow work transforms trigger energy into self-awareness and personal development. The story of Dr. Sarah Mitchell exemplifies this integration beautifully. As a department chair at a prestigious university, Sarah found herself consistently triggered by faculty meetings where colleagues would challenge her decisions or propose alternative approaches. Her initial pattern was to become defensive and assert her authority more forcefully, which created resentment and reduced collaborative effectiveness. Through integration work, Sarah discovered that her triggers were pointing to a deeper pattern: her fear of being seen as incompetent or losing control. This fear was driving her to overmanage situations where collaborative leadership would be more effective. Understanding this pattern allowed Sarah to use trigger energy differently. When she felt defensive impulses arising during meetings, instead of fighting or suppressing them, Sarah learned to recognize them as signals that something important to her was at stake, usually the quality of decisions being made or the welfare of students and faculty. This reframe allowed her to channel trigger energy into more skillful advocacy for her values rather than defensive protection of her ego. Over time, Sarah's leadership style became more authentic and effective. She could advocate strongly for positions she believed in without becoming reactive when others disagreed. Her triggers had become allies in creating the kind of collaborative, high-integrity academic environment she truly wanted to lead. The ultimate paradox of trigger mastery is that the more skillfully you learn to work with your emotional triggers, the less you need to control or eliminate them. True mastery involves developing such a trusting, collaborative relationship with your emotional system that triggers become teachers, guides, and sources of creative energy rather than problems to be managed. This mastery emerges from recognizing that your emotional system, including its triggers, evolved to serve your highest good, to protect you from genuine threats, guide you toward what matters most, and provide information about your internal and external environment that rational analysis alone cannot access. When you align with this intelligence rather than fighting it, you gain access to emotional wisdom that enhances every aspect of your life. The neurobiology of this mastery state involves what researchers call neural integration, balanced cooperation between different brain systems rather than dominance of one system over others. Brain scans of people with high emotional intelligence show coordinated activity across limbic regions, prefrontal cortex, and insular awareness centers, creating what appears to be whole brain harmony. This integration doesn't eliminate emotional responses, it refines them. You become more emotionally responsive rather than less, but your responses become more nuanced, appropriate, and constructive. You develop what might be called emotional precision, the ability to feel deeply while responding skillfully. The mastery paradox also involves recognizing that your triggers often contain information about collective as well as personal dynamics. Your individual emotional responses are embedded in larger social, cultural, and even evolutionary patterns. Understanding this broader context allows you to use trigger energy not just for personal healing but for contributing to positive change in your communities and relationships. When you're triggered by injustice, your emotional response might be calling you to contribute to creating more equitable systems. When you're triggered by disconnection, it might be pointing toward your role in building stronger communities. When you're triggered by meaninglessness, it might be guiding you toward expressing your deeper purpose and values. Consider the journey of Marcus Williams, a social worker who initially saw his emotional sensitivity as a professional liability. Marcus would become deeply affected by his clients' suffering, sometimes to the point of burnout and emotional exhaustion. He tried various strategies to toughen up and maintain professional boundaries, but these approaches left him feeling disconnected from the passion that drew him to social work originally. Through developing trigger mastery, Marcus learned to work with his emotional sensitivity as a professional asset rather than a limitation. His deep empathetic responses, when properly channeled, became sources of insight about his clients' needs and effective intervention strategies. He learned to feel deeply while maintaining the emotional regulation necessary for sustainable service. Marcus developed the ability to use his emotional triggers as diagnostic information. When he felt overwhelmed by a client's situation, it often indicated that the client was feeling overwhelmed and needed additional support systems. When he felt hopeless about a case, it frequently reflected the client's own sense of hopelessness that needed to be addressed directly. Over time, Marcus became known for his exceptional ability to connect with difficult clients and create breakthrough moments in seemingly hopeless situations. His emotional sensitivity, once seen as a weakness, had become his greatest professional strength through conscious integration and skillful application. The hidden power of emotional triggers lies not in their elimination but in their transformation, from unconscious programs that control your behavior into conscious allies that enhance your wisdom, authenticity, and effectiveness. Every trigger contains both a message and an opportunity. The message reveals something important about your values, needs, or growth edges, while the opportunity invites you to respond with greater skill and awareness than before. Mastering your emotional triggers is perhaps the most practical form of personal development you can undertake, because triggers touch every aspect of your life: your relationships, your work performance, your decision-making, your creative expression, and your sense of meaning and purpose. When you transform your relationship with emotional intensity, you transform your capacity for authentic living. The neuroscience reveals that emotional mastery isn't about becoming less emotional. It's about becoming more emotionally intelligent, more responsive rather than reactive, more integrated rather than fragmented. Your emotional system contains sophisticated wisdom that rational analysis alone cannot provide, but this wisdom becomes accessible only when you learn to work with emotional energy skillfully rather than being overwhelmed by it. Remember that every trigger you learn to master not only improves your own life but contributes to the emotional climate of every relationship and community you're part of. When you respond consciously rather than react automatically, you interrupt cycles of reactive escalation and model possibilities for more constructive engagement. Your personal emotional mastery becomes a gift to everyone around you. The journey of trigger mastery is ongoing. There will always be new situations that challenge your emotional equilibrium, new growth edges that reveal themselves through intense responses. But each trigger you learn to work with skillfully increases your overall capacity for navigating life's challenges with wisdom, compassion, and authentic strength. Your triggers are not evidence of emotional weakness. They're indicators of emotional depth and sensitivity that, when consciously developed, become sources of insight, creativity, and genuine personal power. The question isn't whether you'll encounter emotional triggers, but whether you'll learn to decode their messages and channel their energy toward creating the life and relationships you truly want. If this exploration of emotional triggers and conscious response resonated with you, subscribe for more insights into practical neuroscience and emotional intelligence. Understanding your emotional system isn't just personally valuable, it's essential for creating the kind of relationships, communities, and world that reflect our highest human possibilities. What trigger will you begin to befriend and learn from, starting today?